All right, while people are coming in, I just finished. Okay, now let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the final episode of our inaugural CNN Books Week, organized by NUS Department of Communications and New Media, co-organized by the Com Policy and Technology section of IAMCR and CCA, the Chinese Communication Association. I'd like to take this opportunity to again thank you all, to our co-organizers and also our student helpers, Changwen, Zichen, Ziyi, and the admin team. Without their logistic labor, artistic design, and effective care, this Books Week would not have been possible. Please join me to give them a virtual round of applause. Okay, you can use the plus sign too. Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah, our heartfelt gratitude goes to all book authors and editors who have joined us this week, especially Dr. Silvia Lindtner, whose masterpiece we will discuss tonight. Dr. Lindtner is associate professor at the University of Michigan's School of Information, where she is also associate director of the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing, ESC, which I also call the Center for Escape. More than a nuanced ethnographer and a true thought leader, Silvia is super active in leading projects and collectives tackling issues of digital innovation, production cultures, and issues of labor, such as Precarity Lab in Ann Arbor, and also Hacked Matter in China. Truth be told, I've always wanted to work with Silvia, and I've always tried to create opportunities of collaboration with her. One such attempt just failed earlier this week when our joint grant proposal was declined 3 days ago. But that was no big deal at all, because I know this week I will have another intellectual joint venture. Okay, that is this event now, and I know I will not be disappointed. Silvia and I actually go a long way back to 12 years ago when she was still a PhD candidate at UC Irvine. She was our shining star at the 8th CIRC, Chinese Internet Research Conference, held at Peking University, Beijing in 2010, when her paper, co-authored with Marcela Stiplawicz, won the Best Student Paper contest. Since then, we met regularly at CIRC, and she was so kind to show me around the maker spaces she was studying in Shanghai and also Shenzhen. Reading vivid descriptions in this book brought back fond memories from our field trips. So earlier today, we spent time with Dr. Lili Irani to discuss her book on entrepreneurial citizenship in India. We ended that session by saying that we will be chasing innovation from India to China. So here we are, confronted with many similar issues of digital innovation, social division, and ideological manipulation, not only in China, but also the Silicon Valley and worldwide. The book's title, Prototype Nation, reads deceptively simple. Yet, when you sink your teeth into the book, you realize there are many ways to reinterpret the meanings. Does it mean China is the place full of digital prototypes? Or does it mean China is the product itself being prototyped and socially engineered? Silvia will revisit her argument for us for about 35 minutes. She will then be joined by our lead discussant, Dr. Alex Lambert, my dear colleague at the CNN department. Alex is a cultural and technological theorist and a qualitative research innovator. He conducts ethnography in some of Singapore's makerspaces too. And he's a musician and DJ. The background music we use today is from his side project, Bokono. Follow him on SoundCloud if you like funky house. After Alex comments, Silvia will give her responses before we open up the floor. Tonight, we also will have a very special guest, Liu Yan. If you have read the book, you would remember this name that was mentioned 28 times in this volume. For example, when Silvia discusses 新车间, or cited from Liu Yan's TEDx talk, right? Silvia first introduced me to Liu Yan more than a decade ago, and we got reconnected last year to help NUS promote social innovation and tech entrepreneurship among our graduates. It is a great pity and a big loss for NUS that Liu Yan will be leaving Singapore this weekend. Thus, I'd also like to ask people to stay at the very end. At the very end, my co-organizer for the whole week-long events, Wei Yu, will also give a wrap-up comments. Okay, and after that, that's the end of our formal session. Okay, and we will stop recording then, and then we will throw a party, a virtual farewell party for Liu Yan, and also to celebrate Silvia's new book as well. Okay, so this very last part will not be recorded, and you will be most welcome to stay until the very end. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Silvia Lindtner, author of Prototype Nation.
Thank you, Jack, so much for this these really warm words of introduction, very moving, and I'm so honored, and it feels so special to be here with you all today. As Jack was saying, you know, some of the research that informs this book goes back a long time, and there's a lot of shared and personal memories with some of the people here in the remote Zoom call. So yeah, it's such a delight, and really thank you all so much for making this happen. Thank you, Jack and Wei Yu and Changwen and Alex for being here and being my discussant. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So hopefully you all can see that. So I'm really delighted to share with you some of the ethnographic stories that are in the book. I was teasing out some particular stories for the purpose of this talk today that I thought you might find interesting, and we'll also tie them to some of the key concepts that we can then talk about in the Q&A. As Jack was already mentioning, the book draws on over 10 years of ethnographic research, out of which I spent roughly 5 years living in China. And so the talk today will really be weaving together different sites from my research that was taking place in maker spaces, incubator spaces, but also in a manufacturing context, to really tell a story about the role that technology production plays in contemporary governance in China. So both the book and the talk today, my aim is really to challenge some of these more common and pervasive portrayals of China as either a threatening other, as is very commonly sort of the story that we see in especially Western news media today, or as simply newly innovative. So the book complicates the sort of simple binary and attempts to really tell a more complicated story there. So instead, you know, my attempt is really to show how a study of tech production in China has much to say, for instance, not only about what's going on in China, but also has a lot to say about things like Western imperialism and colonialism. And so I will unpack what I mean by all of that throughout the talk. And just to begin, since also Jack was already mentioning makerspaces, I wanted to start with this image here on the screen. Some of you might know this is an image of Chaihua, which is one of China's earlier makerspaces. It is a very small room, as many makerspaces are, roughly 15 by square meter, on the second floor of a refurbished factory building in a creative industry park in Shenzhen. It's a small community space that provides its members with access to things like low-cost machines and open source tools to hack and tinker with hardware. Again, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these kinds of spaces. They were often also referred to as hacker spaces and have really proliferated in the thousands around the globe following the 2007 and 8 financial crisis. So in 2008 was the year when the number of hackerspaces worldwide went from 50 to over 1,000. So within a very short time span. And these hackerspaces were not the kind of spaces that were at that time still frequently, as they were frequently portrayed in movies, so man illegally accessing information or breaking security barriers, for instance. The kind of hacking that took place at places like Chaihua was really a project, as its members understood it, of self-transformation from a passive consumer into what people began referring to as a maker. So somebody who intervened in social, economic, and political processes via technological experimentation. So the people who identified with this particular form of making produced what we might think of as prototypes of intervention that made this very promise concrete. So they made, for instance, things like DIY cell phones that showed that you and I, rather than a big corporate player like Apple, can control the design and inner workings of your communication devices. They open up proprietary health devices to demonstrate how you and I can regain ownership of our body's data, like this project here that hacked the glucose monitoring device Dexcom to create an artificial pancreas. And they made open source 3D printers to make palpable how you and I can mass produce in our own homes. And on the screen, of course, is an early example of the 3D printer MakerBot when it was still open source. So these prototypes of intervention, so to say, demoed how to see oneself as capable of intervening in things like industrial production, automation, and broken healthcare systems. They created a feeling of being able to intervene at scale, all the way from the individual body to national and globalized industrial production. They promised, so to say, to return the means of production to the people. So in 2012, the former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, Chris Anderson, celebrated this promise in his book on the topic as follows. And this is a quote from the book here. He says, "The ability to manufacture local or global at will is a huge advantage. That simple menu option of a digitized machine like the 3D printer compresses 3 centuries of industrial revolution into a single mouse click. If Karl Marx was here today, his jaw would be on the floor. Talk about controlling the tools of production. You can now set factories into motion with a mouse click." So Anderson's book was really one of many other prominent writings on the maker movement that came out at that time that invoked, very similar to Anderson here, socialist imagery and language. They claimed that making would return control to the people, that it would democratize industrial production and tech innovation, and that it was a tool to achieve social justice and undo large corporate monopoly and even state power. Quite different from Karl Marx, though, who, of course, understood alternatives to capitalism as emerging from things like class struggle, solidarity movements, and the collectivization of workers. These writings on making that came out of mostly sort of a Western-centric context portrayed individual self-actualization as desirable. So notably here, too, Anderson describes making's transformative power as stemming not from a collective we, but from many individual yous. You can now set factories into motion with a single-handed mouse click. So these writings and projects really construed one of the core techniques of neoliberal governance. So this framing of the self on economic terms as something that was desirable and as a key to enabling social change. So they produced what might on first glance seem like an inherent contradiction, what I call in the book a socialist pitch. So pitching is typically associated with a startup's ability to formulate itself as attractive to venture capital by producing a feeling of anticipation and a promise of scale. So the socialist pitch then too, I argue, derives its power from this very technique of producing an affect, a feeling of exuberant excitement, of scale, and of buy-in, by drawing specifically on the language and the image of social change and justice. So pitching, of course, works through promise rather than actual change. For instance, VCs, venture capital investors, fund ideas rather than, or prototypes of intervention rather than finished products. And so the socialist pitch too is aimed not at social justice per se, but at creating a feeling that technological intervention itself is social justice. So Chaihua Makerspace, with which I began, had become a well-known member of what prominent figures like Chris Anderson had pitched as a global movement that would return power and control to the people. And so you might think this is not the kind of space, though, where one would expect to find the Prime Minister of China on an official state visit. As surprising as it seems, though, China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang did indeed visit Chaihuo Makerspace and endorsed its prototypes of intervention on an official state visit in January 2015. And this is a photo that was circulated on the web in Chinese news media at the time, with the Prime Minister sort of at the center here in the middle, surrounded by people he was meeting at Chaihuo. And so during his visit, the Prime Minister declared officially, makers show the vitality of entrepreneurship and innovation among the people, and such creativity will serve as a lasting engine of China's economic growth in the future. And the visit itself was documented quite vividly by state media. I pulled some of the photos here and displayed them on the slide here. The government website hosted a whole photo essay that really portrayed the Prime Minister, as he was surrounded by this crowd of young men, as who showed off their latest technological creations, as someone who was very personable and someone who appeared to enjoy mingling with the group of young men. The message was that the Prime Minister was himself a maker at heart, as state media at that time put it, and a politician who was invested in empowering citizens to make things happen. Most importantly, though, the endorsements of makerspaces like Chaihuo by the CCP positioned the young men depicted side by side the Prime Minister as model makers, so as young Chinese engineers who had transformed themselves via the socialist pitch into entrepreneurial change makers. By prototyping themselves anew, they would, so to say, also prototype the nation anew. And what I mean by that, I will come back throughout the talk today. So only a couple of months after the Prime Minister had returned to Beijing, he announced a new national policy that escalated making into a nationwide project. This policy was written around 3 key terms, which loosely translate into mass makerspace, mass entrepreneurship, and mass innovation. And these terms really framed the policy's key directive, which called upon provincial, municipal, and district level governments to allocate their existing resources. So the government didn't actually make available per se new funding, but called upon these local governments to use their existing resources towards setting up these so-called mass maker spaces or incubator spaces that were kind of modeled on Chaihuo. And so the policy was aimed at cultivating, as the policy itself put it, a maker spirit amongst the masses, a spirit that would in turn help foster an attitude of quote unquote self-making and quote unquote self-entrepreneurship. So in other words, the policy held up making as a technique of self-transformation. So as the transformation of the self from an economic actor into an entrepreneurial actor. So in the book, I offer an ethnographic study of making for what it can tell us about the role that technology plays in contemporary governance in China. I explore how the promise of democratized tech innovation, as it was championed by maker advocates, became what I call a techno-political instrument of affect that served the CCP's broader interests to reposition China as a forward-looking and innovative nation. So crucially, the appropriation of making by the Chinese government mobilized feelings of optimism, positivity, and happiness in the very moment that China's Communist Party feared social and political instability due to China's first significant economic slowdown since the 1980s economic opening reforms. So by prototype nation then, I mean the stipulation that a nation can and should function as a prototype. So the notion that a nation and its citizenry serve as the raw material for a new model. For instance, China as modeling an alternative to Western approaches of technology innovation and economic development. So I use the prototype as an analytical concept grounded in practices of tech production and design. As the anthropologist Lucy Suchman notes, the prototype has particular performative characteristics within the work of technology design. It is a material and concrete proposal of alternative ways of thinking about technology and its role in the world. So not simply as a matter of talk, but as a means for trying the proposal out. So in other words, the affective qualities of the prototype lie in its simultaneous functioning as object, so a model, and process, testing, tinkering, experimenting. The term refers to both the normative modeling, so the making concrete or realizing of specific ideas, and the making of an alternative, which carries the potential for contestation and intervention. So one of the key promises of the maker movement was that prototyping itself, the testing and modeling of a technological alternative, was no longer reserved for elites, for scientists, for engineers, designers. In the book, I show how this very promise of democratized tech innovation was also what normalized normative notions of what constitutes the right kind of model and the right kind of prototype. So the idea that a nation can function as a prototype, as a way of modeling a new way of life for others is of course not new. It is historically constituted through projects of modernization, economic development, and colonization. The historian R.F. Dierlich reminds us that the European invention of the nation state was the ultimate vehicle of modernity. So in other words, the European nation was posited as a prototype of modern progress and economic development, with Europe positioned as the archetype. And other regions, of course, were construed as in need to learn from the Western model nations. So this colonial project of prototyping a certain way of life, I argue, endures through the ideals and practices of contemporary technology innovation. Colonial pasts and racialized forms of othering reverberate through the prototype nation. And to show how exactly this unfolds is a key task of the book, and also my goal in the talk today. I want to add that as a feminist ethnography that weaves together sensibilities from post-colonial science and technology studies and feminist approaches to computing, the book attends to the bodies and sites that were excluded from this very reinvestment in the nation and in certain people and regions with this exuberant feeling of excitement and future making. And I will focus on that in the talk as well today. So it was in many ways no coincidence that China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang endorsed the makerspace Chaihuo located in Shenzhen rather than any of the other 100 of such spaces that had operated in China already at that time, or even China's first makerspace that Jack mentioned briefly earlier, that Liu Yan and David Li were so centrally involved in Xinjiang in Shanghai. So there was I argue, a reason for why the Prime Minister turned to Shenzhen at this particular moment. The same year of the Prime Minister's visit to Shenzhen, Wired magazine had published this issue that you see here on the screen that claimed that it was now time to copy China. Part of the issue were a series of essays about tech innovation in the city of Shenzhen. The cover featured a story of Lei Jun, the founder of Xiaomi, a mobile phone company that many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with, which had grown out of what many people had begun refer to as Shenzhen's unique innovation ecosystem. So Wired's cover story was really a culmination of Western media coverage about Shenzhen that had within the time span of only a few years rewritten the region in the global tech imagination. So what had long been decried as a site of mere execution of Western ideas, a site of low quality and copycat production, of labor exploitation, was suddenly celebrated as the Silicon Valley of hardware, as a hothouse of innovation, where hardware entrepreneurs would go and even outdo Silicon Valley. So these stories really began proliferating in the years following the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. And I argue that paying attention to this particular moment and historical moment is important for us to understand the power that these stories actually had. So the years following the crisis were marked by a broader reckoning with the complicity of tech production in things like labor exploitation, resource extraction, and capitalist expansion. So this was a time when not only scholars, but a growing number of news media and broader sort of tech enthusiasts began suddenly warning about the costs of ruthless neoliberal capitalism and the precarious work conditions it had created. And increasingly, people criticized Silicon Valley as a central culprit in this very process and in this very destabilization. So China as prototype nation, as a contested alternative to Western approaches to tech innovation, I argue was co-produced by this specific techno-crisis thinking that was particularly pronounced in the United States. So it was a moment when the tech industry and Silicon Valley in particular found itself confronted with a growing suspicion that the values that had propagated since the 1990s, so the countercultural ideal of tearing down hierarchies and in the hierarchy's place build a peer-to-peer and collaborative society, as Fred Turner in 2015 describes it, that countercultural ideal, more and more people began realizing had really benefited only a small minority. And on the screen, of course, you can see Apple's famous 1984 ad for the Macintosh computer, which is often sort of a quintessential example of this countercultural ideal of tearing down these sort of hierarchical structures. So it was in this very moment, so in this moment of doubt over this countercultural promise, that China, and more precisely the south of China, was re-articulated by a range of actors who were active in the global tech industry, in investment, in higher education, in policy, as a place where the future was now made, as newly innovative, exactly because it had long been and continued to be understood as not as modern or not as modern the same way as the West. So this is just an example of sort of this broader discourse here. For instance, in 2014, Joy Itu was at that time still director of the MIT Media Lab, traveled with a group of his students and faculty to Shenzhen. Upon his return, he gave a TED talk in which he argued that traveling to Shenzhen was like going back in time and learning from the past, momentarily reliving the foundations of Japan's technological and economic success. So in these kinds of stories, a discourse of adventure and exploration engulfed what we might call this invention of Shenzhen, which is also visible here in this quote from an interview I conducted with the director of a Silicon Valley funded incubator program that had opened up in Shenzhen in 2012. So Chinese people here are articulated as quote unquote making things happen, as so to say providing agency to the Western innovator, the Western engineer and designer, who had begun to increasingly fear, as I just mentioned it earlier, things like precarity and gig work and the feminization of his own creative labor. So Shenzhen, these men promised, and many of them were men, was a place where one could feel again in control. And I argue that this casual reference to the pop science fiction series Star Trek that you see at the end of the quote here of boldly going where no man has gone before is not to underestimate in this context. So often in these stories about Shenzhen, references to Star Trek were quite frequent. As a narrative of American frontierism, references to Star Trek, I argue, legitimized an engagement with China based on a masculine and colonial narrative of adventure, exploration, and technological mastery. So if space was the final frontier to be mastered by individuals empowered by the latest technological advances, which is of course the story of Star Trek, then here China was framed as the untamed land of copycat to be mastered by the maker turned entrepreneur. So in 2013, I spent a year embedded as an ethnographer in one such foreign funded incubator program in Shenzhen. The promotional materials of the program claimed that it was taking the maker movement to the next level. It invested, so to say, in makers whose prototypes promised to scale into products. So think data-driven solutions, robots and drones, smart systems, Internet of Things, wearable technologies, and so on. So this particular program was backed by a Silicon Valley venture capital firm that has strategically located its headquarters in Ireland for tax reduction purposes. And the investors and managers that ran the incubator were a group of powerful white men who were well known in the circles of global capital investment. They appropriated socialist imagery of China's own past to pitch the location of their program in Shenzhen in revolutionary terms. And you see an example of this here on the screen. So by embedding themselves into the city's electronic markets, its factories, and supply chain networks, makers would learn how to become real-world entrepreneurs, so the promise of the program. They would no longer tinker with electronics in a makerspace or in their basements, but they would hack economies of scale, global supply chains, and capitalism itself. So in chapters 4 and 5 of the book, I show in much depth how this socialist pitch of entrepreneurial life in Shenzhen that refashioned colonial discourses of frontier making, of mastery and control, operates as what SDS scholars would call a market device, but it operated as a market device of finance capitalism. So it remoralized, so to say, the economization of humans and things. So the economization of life, which is this notion that life itself should serve the interests of the market or the interests of investors, here is portrayed as something that is actually hopeful and is providing individuals with a hacktivist kind of agency. In the political and economic regime of tech innovation and venture capital, capitalist expansion, so to say, is pitched as participatory, as available to all of us. Processes of economization and capitalist expansion then no longer appear to be just a natural consequence of competition, but rather appear to be hackable, something we can make our own. So in other words, the neoliberal doctrine of inevitability, which is the idea that capitalist expansion or even automation are natural processes rather than the outcome of human choices, is imbued with a feeling of agency. So economic life is framed as entrepreneurial life. So during my ethnographic engagement with the incubator, I spent much time with two women, Sophie and Mei Yun, who were the two Chinese staff workers employed by the incubator. This is how the European director of the incubator introduced the two women on the first day of the program. He said, "There's a thing about Sophie and Mei Yun. They are the office managers. They make our lives better. They will make sure shit works around here. If it doesn't work, just remember, it must be their fault. Repeat after me, nothing is my fault. It must be their fault. When shit is broken, talk to them." So this brief introduction to the two female Chinese staff really set the tone for how the startup teams would approach them over the months to follow. Their job was to help guide the startup teams through the emotional ups and downs of their own entrepreneurial labor in Shenzhen. When shit was broken, they would fix it. When the stress levels amongst the startups went up, Sophie and Mei Yun would provide distraction and think of fun leisure activities. So their responsibility really was, unlike the startups, to stay in the background, to take care of the program's day-to-day functioning and the startup's well-being. Another job that they had was to organize and accompany factory tours. So factory tours was really crucial for these mostly foreign startups that the incubator invested in, not only to build relationships to potential partners in manufacturing, but also to produce this kind of affect, this feeling of entrepreneurial life that many had come to associate with Shenzhen, as I was describing it earlier. So this feeling that by embedding oneself into China's manufacturing and supply chain networks, we would all be able to hack and intervene on a scale of the political economy that seems typically out of reach for most people, and especially seems to be out of reach for engineers or designers. So again, this kind of work of producing this affect on behalf of the startups that these two women performed was really, really important and crucial for the very functioning of the incubator. So over years of research, I met many young women and some young men who were hired into positions not unlike Sophie and Mei Yun. They were hired to perform what I call in the book happiness labor. Happiness labor is the work that goes into producing a feeling of optimism and cheerful delight. It is not unlike what Arlie Hochschild describes as emotional labor, but is more specifically the kind of labor that a range of new organizational models of tech production, so think incubators, co-working spaces, maker spaces, and open innovation labs, rely on in order to sustain the precarious conditions of the entrepreneurial life that they both demand and celebrate. So in other words, happiness labor allows the entrepreneur to sustain a good feeling about technology, despite the increasing realization that for many, the self-investment will never pay actually off. So many of the young men and women I found employed in jobs like these in China spoke fluent English, which they had acquired either by rigorous self-study or through college education. And many of them were also severely underpaid and were often paid about the same or at times even less than the migrant workers employed in the electronics factories in Shenzhen. Over time, the kind of happiness labor that was part of Sophie and Mei Yun's work became normalized amongst the startup teams. They began relating to them as friends and saw their labor as a form of peer production, as this quote here too illustrates. The startup's revision of Sophie and Mayun's role from a worker to a peer masked the gendered divisions of labor at the incubator and the uneven positionality between the firm's female Chinese employees and the mostly white and male entrepreneurs it invested in. So following the 2015 government initiative that I had mentioned earlier, focused on building these innovation or maker spaces for the people, spaces like the Silicon Valley funded incubator where I had done my fieldwork had become a model of sorts for a gradual but quite significant urban upgrade of Shenzhen and also in other cities in China at that time. So in the case of Shenzhen, for instance, its old production sites, so spaces in the Shenzhen electronic markets, for instance, which is depicted here on the left, were slowly and partially redesigned to look more and more like the kinds of incubator and maker spaces that the government had identified as cultivating an entrepreneurial maker spirit amongst the masses. So this aesthetic urban upgrade of the city was meant to build what I call the entrepreneurial factory. So it's not just an aesthetic upgrade in that sense that it was just sort of a surface sort of development. I really argue that the aesthetic upgrade itself had significant social consequences. So the entrepreneurial factory operates by producing feelings instead of products. So it operates very differently from a typical factory. I argue that it is aimed at inducing in workers and engineers of China's industrial production industry the desire to see themselves as passionate entrepreneurial change makers, to turn themselves into assets on behalf of the nation and to serve the government's own interests, for instance, its project of industrial upgrade, with its Made in China 2025 project, for instance, or even its global development initiatives such as the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A as well. So the entrepreneurial factory, I argue, operates alongside what the autonomous and feminist Marxists have called the social factory. So they call that, they sort of created this sort of analytic of the social factory to describe how capital subsumes various aspects of social life for the accumulation of value. So I used the concept of the entrepreneurial factory to demonstrate that it is not only true that factory-like exploitation is seeping into various corners of our life. So think, for instance, gig work, but that the inverse is the case as well, that factory work itself is increasingly shaped by the kinds of exploitation we see happening in the creative and tech industries. So in my research, I followed several young men working in manufacturing who the entrepreneurial factory enrolled in order to understand how it affected them. One of them was Robin. When I first met him, he was about 30 years old, and he had moved to Shenzhen from a rural part of China at the urging of a relative at that time to leave behind a life in agriculture. I stayed in touch with Robin over the years. In 2016, I visited his office, depicted here on the screen, at the outskirts of the city. He had invited me to meet over tea to tell me about an exciting new business opportunity. A childhood friend from his hometown in rural China had opened up a shoe factory in Ethiopia. And the idea was that Robin would get a section of that factory to have some of his own products assembled there. So the shoe factory's promotional materials signaled more than an attractive business venture. Echoing some of the official rhetoric of the CCP around its Belt and Road Initiative, the story here was really one about mutual growth, win-win, and China's own history of rapid economic development, posited as a model for Africa. But Robin explained to me that day we met that there was really no direct government support for people like him. The expectation was that people like Robin would self-invest by going out, or chu in Chinese. So many of the men I met would explain to me that this form of going out, or going to Africa, for instance, entailed a lot of personal and professional risks. So these could be quite high, and nevertheless, they understood going out as carrying potential to redeem China from a place known as fake and low quality to a place known for cutting edge innovation by way of upgrading themselves from quote unquote backwards farmers or quote unquote backwards factory producers into globally savvy tech entrepreneurs. So in the words of Robin, he described this as, this is a matter of feeling responsible. In Shenzhen, people push you to go farther, but our responsibility, our mission also becomes a burden. We are responsible for many workers, and this makes us feel like we cannot stop, we cannot let go. So a year later, when I returned to Shenzhen and met with Robin, he had moved to a new office located in one of Shenzhen's newest and most prime real estates, Shenzhen Bay, which is here on the screen. As we sat in his new office, 30 floors up the modern high-rise overlooking a pristine golf course landscape, he showed me this video conferencing system he had set up and the photos from his latest trips to Ethiopia and Kenya. And as he was showing me all of this, he suddenly interrupted himself and said, Silvia, this is not it. This is not it. I envy you. You are respected no matter where you go. But when I go to Africa, or if I went to the United States, I'm not respected. That's why we still have aspirations. That's why we hope to be respected. This is my goal. I'm pursuing this goal. And that's why, although today I could have a really good life, I'm still living the life of a loser. So the entrepreneurial factory runs on this very promise of the good life that Robin invokes here, which is continuously postponed for many Chinese men like Robin, who is still deemed low quality and still not representative of the nation's modern ambitions, and especially for many Chinese women who are relegated to happiness labor. A couple of days after my visit, Robin sent me a WeChat message with the following news clipping from the Daily Mail in the UK that read, Shenzhen, China's reform pioneer, leads tech revolution. Not without a hint of pride, Robin directed me to read until the end of the article, where it featured him right next to one of the American investors who had begun play an active role in the city. It is this attachment to whiteness, I argue, that promised happiness and that promised to overcome racism in the future that made many people I encountered in China's manufacturing industry to endure the violence of the entrepreneurial factory that demanded of them to take more and more risks, to self-economize, to overwork, and to take responsibility on behalf of the nation and the party state. So I built here specifically on the feminist scholar and philosopher Sarah Ahmed's notion of the promise of happiness. This is a quote from her book on the topic. The civilizing mission of the colonial periods could be described as a happiness mission. Colonized people were framed as lacking the qualities or attributes necessary for a happy state of existence, almost the same but not quite, almost the same but not white, almost happy but not quite. So the Chinese Communist Party state continuously and strategically invokes China's own past of partial colonization, which it refers to as the period of national humiliation. It portrays citizens like Robin, for instance, as lacking in civility and quality and is in need of modern upgrade. Only when that happens can the nation be redeemed, so to say. So the entrepreneurial factory then posits certain people in certain spaces. So think back about China Makerspace and how its young makers were endorsed by the Chinese government as the right kind of prototypes of China's future, of the Chinese dream, and of the government's ambition to build what it calls an indigenous innovation economy. So it was via the appropriation of making and its associations with social justice, with agency and happiness, that the CCP could, so to say, pitch itself as acting in the interests of the people, as committed to people's pursuits of happiness. So in other words, the CCP appears almost as a benevolent, optimistic peer of the people who works right in step with people's dreams and hopes for justice. Under President Xi Jinping, this pursuit of happiness, feminist scholar Chia Yang shows us, has been rendered a moral imperative for the so-called quality modern citizen. The CCP, which is more commonly associated with top-down authoritarian control, governs then select groups of its citizenry via this promise of happiness. So happiness might be granted, for instance, if and only if people like Robin find ways on their own to go out to places like Ethiopia on behalf of the nation to work alongside the CCP and its ambitions of infrastructural upgrade and its ambitions to reposition China globally via, for instance, its projects like the BRI. Okay, I will now offer some brief concluding thoughts. So the idea that China constitutes a place to prototype alternatives to existing models of modern technological progress would have sounded absurd to most people 10 years ago when I started the research that informs this book. This is, of course, so much less the case more recently. So Western China commentators and Western news media have variously proliferated a sense that we are witnessing the rise of an emboldened China, one that more forcefully and assertively demands that the world, and the West in particular, ought to take it seriously as an equal and threatening player in the global political economy and in technology innovation in particular. And indeed, some people speculate that the 21st century will be China's century. My book complicates these narratives of what the historian Gabriel Hecht calls rupture talk. The notion of rupture, I argue, cannot explain China's current moment, nor the ideals of the maker movement. Indeed, rupture talk renders invisible the contingencies between past and present dreams of China as an alternative model or prototype nation. It renders invisible how these dreams of alternative modes of future making are contingent and were contingent on the rise and spread of the promise of making and the machineries of the entrepreneurial factory. So the book attends to these occluded contingencies of colonial pasts and presents that co-produce China as prototype nation. For instance, I've shown today that the ideals and practices of a global maker movement and the imaginary of a quote-unquote new China were co-produced amidst a broadening suspicion of the tech industry. The tenacity of technological promise in this very moment of a broadening critique of the tech industry depended on the select recruitment of once excluded bodies and sites. So for instance, young Chinese engineers. In the entrepreneurial factory, certain forms of life are subsumed under capital production, while others are continuously excluded. It is in these exclusions, however, that we also find gaps in this seemingly smooth operation of finance capitalism. So I channel here the feminist anthropologist Anna Tsing, who reminds us, if we end the story with decay, we abandon all hope or turn our attention to other sites of promise and ruin, promise and ruin. As a feminist ethnography, Prototype Nation attends to the labor, the bodies, the places, instruments, and techniques that were necessary to cultivate and maintain entrepreneurial life, like happiness labor, as I described it today. I argue that if we attend to this form of labor, it becomes clear that the entrepreneurial factory is not inevitable, but it has to be nurtured and maintained. So if we notice this labor, we also realize that the relationship between technology and markets can indeed be otherwise. This requires us, though, I argue, to attend to modes of resistance that don't look like this familiar image of the countercultural hacker who attacks and tears down the system. So throughout the book, and especially in chapter 5, I document the fleeting, ambiguous, and complicit acts of resistance that happiness workers engage in, and that often go unnoticed, that we don't celebrate as forms of resistance at all, actually. It was in their seeming futility, in their non-compliance with pitching, that these acts of often invisibilized resistance, where we can then, if we notice them, we can then also notice a gap, I argue, in the functional alignment of dreaming of better futures and the anticipatory logics of finance capitalism. And with this, I would like to end, and thank you so much for your attention. I put up some information here on this slide, how you can reach me. And the book is still 30% off with code P234 through the Princeton University Press website as well. Thank you so much for being here today. And I now really look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Silvia. That was brilliant and beautiful. So over to Alex.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks Silvia. It's been an honor to read this work and discuss it, and I agree with Jack that it is a masterful work. So I guess I've got just a few points to make and then a few questions to ask. You describe this fascinating new attitude, namely that capitalist inequity does not require an alternative system, but rather capitalism is hackable by each individual in a democratic or democratized sense, and such that they can actualize this happy, good life. And this is what you call the socialist pitch. I love your use of socialist here, because it seems to recuperate a sense of history, or of futurity, of hopeful possibility of material equity. And this attitude was partly taken from the techie Californians at a pivotal point in China's contemporary post-colonial, post-Maoist era, at a critical point when it needed to discipline its citizens as productive in a new high-tech economy. So the promise of happiness is also the promise of being a good citizen. The two coalesce at this point. And then for me, this book has three other central, really amazing arguments. First, this ideological, affective, and political economic situation required nurturing. And one of the great values of your book, as I see it, is the richness, the stunning richness of detail in your description and conceptualization of this nurturing process, including all the spaces, economic zones, organizations, and other actors involved at local, regional, and transnational levels. And the second great value for me is the way you show this nurturing to produce what you call slow violence, as each installation of this maker ethos actually produces new forms of class, gender, and race division. And for most, like the migrants who are trying to make it in Shenzhen, the promise of happiness is a false one, right? Yeah, and perhaps it's always false, but particularly false for them. They're not proximate with any of the objects of happiness, to use Ahmed's phrasing. And then thirdly, I love the way you continually return to the theme of depoliticization throughout. Like so many aspects of media and technology related to capitalism, what Jody Dean would call communicative capitalism, the promise of collaboration, sharing, and technical self-fulfillment actually leads to the negation of politics. If we understand politics in any positive sense as a kind of subjectivity that mobilizes a procedure of collective emancipation. So that is key for me about this text. So then I have three questions. My first concerns creativity in China. My second concerns the good life. And my third concerns your process of critique more generally and where it leads us. And they're all absolutely honest questions. And the first two are very simple. And the third one is one I struggle with personally, but in my own work. So yeah, it's perhaps more philosophical. So, you know, the first question, are there at least peripheral forms of creativity that are non-antiquarian, right? They're not nostalgic, but contemporary and innovative, that have not been co-opted by the socialist pitch and are not absolutely defined by the current stage of the dialectical relationship between America and China, between Shenzhen and Silicon Valley, right? That's my first question. You know, and if there are these other forms, do they relate to maker spaces? And if so, how do we explain them? And I don't have the time to go into what's inspiring this question, but what's inspiring it is actually this recent book by Jingu and Justin O'Connor, Red Creative, where they do indeed kind of present imminent forms of innovative, techie, Chinese creativity that can't be really fully captured by this dialectic, right? My second question is related to the good life and happiness, because it seems to me that these are the kind of normative foundations of your moral, ethical, political critique. And I guess I assume that you're not critiquing the good life and happiness in and of themselves. I mean, you could be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but rather this particular historical instantiation of it in China. And so my second question, you know, what are the other alternative forms of the good life that we find in China at the moment that could be competing with the socialist pitch. I've recently been following a blog called Chuang, which is the image of the horse breaking through the gate, that character. And this is really a leftist activist Chinese blog, which conceptualizes the good life in terms of the success, purely the success of mainland labor struggles, and is even unrepentantly Maoist in places. Is this a significant competitor to the socialist pitch? Will the promise of happiness ever become the promise of communism again in China? Again, here's my third question. Those first two questions, I guess, are just, questions about, does an alternative exist? This is the philosophical question. The prescriptive element of your critique advances these key feminist ideas and includes Fisher's ideas of parasitical resistance, Anna Tsing's idea of noticing gaps, Scott's argument that, at least within the bounds of the status quo, the powerless can only really employ small gestural quotidian tactics of resistance. So, I want to focus on this idea of noticing gaps. If I'm reading you right, a gap is something that reveals the structured inequality in the situation, and hence begins a line of questioning with regards to how this situation could be different. You give the fantastic example of your friend Sophie, whose minor gesture of squatting revealed ingrained gender and worker inequalities. So you say that taking note of these gaps in the normative texture of everyday life can actually lead to new affective yearnings for an alternative system. And these yearnings inherently undermine kind of at least the eschatology or teleology of techno-capitalism. I agree with you that gaps, fissures, cracks, glitches, and so forth are essential as starting points. I mean, where does the new come from, if not from some chance encounter with something that is essentially out of place? But capitalism, as you show in many other cases in the book, can co-opt new ideas, new yearnings, new affects, new paradoxical gaps. I dare say that that is capitalism's raison d'etre. In fact, sometimes I fear that the very logic of capitalist development all around the world, when capitalism has to transform itself and adapt, is the logic of the gap. Isn't Deng's calculus of special economic zones a way of producing gaps in Maoist China itself? So here is my key worry. You rightly point out that techno-solutionism negates political subjectivity. How do we know that gap solutionism, or what I would symptomatically call gap noticing, affect producing change solutionism, won't have the same problem? So my third question, my honest question that I struggle with, because this is the philosophical question, does this tactic of taking sideways glances to notice gaps actually say anything about how to build an effective political subjectivity? That is, how can we show fidelity to what a gap reveals in a way that can never be co-opted?
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah. In 9 minutes, okay, that's a lot of dry stuff.
Yeah.
In Chinese word, 干货, okay, for 9 minutes. Okay,
Right.
over to Silvia. Could you address this briefly? Okay, then we'll open it up for discussion. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes. I think there's actually, thank you so much, Alex. These are such wonderful thoughts and yeah, really nuanced, and hopefully I think my attempt now will be to start addressing them, and then hopefully we can also have more future conversations. But it seems like a theme that actually cuts through your questions is this sort of tension, which is sort of at the heart of the book. What constitutes an alternative? Who gets to say so? This question of an all-subsuming capitalism that we all sort of find ourselves in, and what is there an out? Who gets to say so? What does that look like, right? It seems your question about the good life, your question about my attention to sort of feminist sensibilities, to think through and theorize alternatives, right? And even your first question about is there a form of creativity in China that escapes the sort of Silicon Valley kind of, or sort of the China-US dialectic relationship? I think they're all questions that are sort of aimed at that fundamental interest, it seems, of like who and what constitutes an alternative. And this has been something I've been thinking a lot about. So maybe I'll start briefly with where you ended with your last question, in terms of could this feminist sensibility and commitment to noticing gaps risk to be just another sort of technique of economization? Is it just another sort of solutionism? And in my view, these techniques of noticing gaps is something that's very different from the kind of techno-solutionism that sort of usually identifies like a single artifact or a single problem and then attempts to solve it and fix it, right? And often we end there. We sort of identify the problem and then we believe we can simply fix it with like a new tech intervention, more technology that will fix the old kind of problems. That's sort of the typical sort of techno-solutionist approach. And the feminist sensibility is quite different from that, in my view. It shies away from stipulating that there is one single alternative, or that there is something like no compromised position, or some sort of authentic position of resistance and counterculture that if we keep looking for it, we'll eventually find it, right? That's sort of the promise of sort of the countercultural hacker. The feminist sensibility says that way looking for the sort of idealized sort of form of resistance is in fact a problem, right? That makes us not notice these other partially compromised, never fully idealized forms of alternatives that are very difficult to celebrate, because we can't just put them on a stage and say, look, the countercultural hero has torn down the system, because they don't look that way, right? And so I find them very meaningful that way, because they get us out of this binary dilemma of saying, on the one hand, there's sort of the exploited, and then there's the superstructure or those empowered that exploit, or that there's an innocent counterculture or hacker versus the status quo or the corporate monopoly, right? It points us to the parasitic, to invoke Anna Fisher, you mentioned as well, these parasitic entanglements where there is no innocent position. And I think that's really important for us to do, because we have gravitated for so long, also as scholars and scholars of technology in particular, to kind of unearthing and finding these more ideal types of resistance. And so yeah, the feminist method, something that I was really sort of finding very useful there. And also in many ways, I mean, this is sort of, when you turn to Tsing or Fisher, or I think you were also invoking Michelle Murphy, like those kinds of theoretical approaches to resistance, what was very remarkable for me was how these forms of pushback are actually something that are quite lived in these daily practices, especially in happiness labor, for instance, in Shenzhen. So maybe this ties us back to your first question about creativity. So is there something of like a Chinese form of creativity that pushes back, against this kind of Silicon Valley model? Or I'm very intrigued by this blog that you mentioned, sort of this turn or return to Mao, or even like Marx revival is going on in China as well, right? Which again, we might then point to how the CCP and Xi Jinping too are invoking Mao and Marx frequently. So there too, it seems like, again, I don't know that blog you're talking about, but there too, it seems like what would be really interesting to kind of trace is how something like, this leftist kind of potentially activist, social justice committed blog might also find resonances again in this official rhetoric of appropriating Marx and Maoist kind of thinking for the purposes of governance. And then not saying this is then a process of complete subsumption. So what I'm really hoping to do with the book, by drawing also on this feminist scholarship, is to point to, again, and this is where the gaps come in, to processes where capital doesn't succeed in this all subsuming reach, right? So the story could very easily be it's all doom and failure. We are done, we can't do anything about this. because capital reaches every corner of our lives. And that will lead, I think, to basically inaction, right? Because then we either give up because we're like then pessimistic about the future, or we might turn again to these optimistic kind of stories of the hero narrative, right? And so my point in drawing specifically also on Sarah Ahmed's notion of the promise of happiness is to redefine what we mean by things like happiness and the good life, and that actually these kinds of actions or bodies or voices that point us to things that are uncomfortable, that don't feel so good, because they point us to processes of racist exclusion, you know, that, for instance, right? Those are actually the kinds of hopeful sites, because they point us to how we then also can amplify and intervene in these processes. So if we just sort of shy away from noticing what feels so uncomfortable, for instance, like this sort of continuous form of racist or gendered exclusion in spaces that are celebrated as peer production, as creative, right? So, but if we attend to what doesn't feel so good, that can be a starting point to amplify voices and sites and bodies that do actually intervene on a daily basis. But again, in terms of their day-to-day actions, not looking necessarily like that countercultural hacker who tears down the system and changes everything single-handedly within a day, which is not, of course, not possible and will not be possible. So I think there's so much more to say, and there was so much nuance to your questions, Alex. Thank you. But I think I'll sort of stop there and see if there's maybe other questions, or I can, if there's not a question, I can keep going as well.
Thank you very much. No, let's open the. That's an amazing response. I'm happy to open the floor.
Yes. So the floor is open now. Thank you both, Silvia and Alex. Anyone would like to start with some comments or questions? And I will give Ozan, raise your hand, please.
Hi, Silvia. Thanks a lot for the wonderful presentation. I don't know if probably you don't remember, but I was the graduate student in the communication department. We were in the same building. So I remember last time I attended your talk a few years ago. So my question is about because this is about also how differences across nations change throughout history, colonization. So what are the and the focus here is definitely more on the individual level and within China, right? So, I mean, one thing that came to my mind is like, for example, in the international regulation of environmental situation, like there is this argument that because of hundreds of years of industrialization and colonial resources usage, the Western countries have been polluting the world for too long. So we cannot have like one argument, one side is coming up, is that we cannot have like full equal levels of regulation right now. So there needs to be some like reciprocatory differential treatment across the nations, those who are developing or who are not yet achieving production economies. So viewed from that perspective, like at the national, across the nations, when we look at, instead of individual level or within China, but when we look at, let's say, China versus US relationship, what similarities, or how can we extend the argument to that national level? Or let me ask it differently. If we were to personify China and US as people, given the historical relationship, what does it mean when we see one side with this debates about copycat economy and also the maker workshops and their relationship with the other country or the personified nation. I hope that was clear, or
yeah, so I think what you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're asking is about what can an analytic that starts from a position of transnational, geopolitical, transregional, and historical intertwining, can that help us see when we think about maybe contemporary politics, or when we even think about this question of, or contestation over environmental justice or climate change, right? So I heard that's what I heard in your question. And I think, yes, it's very important. So I think there's a tendency right now, both in sort of obviously politics, but even in sort of scholarly analysis, to return to kind of a national and sort of the boundary of the nation as sort of the unit of analysis. And this in some ways is tied to sort of things like rising nationalism across regions, a very sort of antagonistic language, I think, that we see both in politics and media, that portray, for instance, something like, let's take technology, surveillance technology in the US as very different from what is happening, for instance, in China. And so something that I'm trying to do with this book that I think can also apply to this broader question about how we should theorize, sort of the nation in a contemporary context, is to really use both historical and ongoing contingencies when it comes to national politics. And again, by contingencies, I mean geopolitical and transnational contingencies as a starting point of our analysis. So rather than using the nation as an exploratory frame to say, oh, this is what might be uniquely Chinese about this context, to point to how actually that very framing of something being uniquely Chinese or something being American, how that in and of itself has become a technique of governance, has become a tool for investors to frame certain regions as more likely to scale or to be worthwhile the investment, right? And so exactly because of that kind of, posing of certain regions, and often it's the nation, as kind of having either unique potential for investment or lacking that very sort of potential for investment. It's so important, I think, for us to always pay attention to how, something like the local or the national is produced in these sort of transnational and geopolitical contingencies. Sorry, that was a very abstract answer to your question, but did I understand fully?
Yeah. If I can jump in very, very quickly here, is that this book mostly deal with national and subnational, okay, even organizational and interpersonal levels of analysis, okay. But at the same time, because earlier today we discussed Lily's, chasing innovation, and there were also questions about Indian capitalism, okay, Indian digital capitalism, right? So my thinking at this point, of course, at the national and the subnational level, we can always make more complicated, situated, analysis, okay, like the way I think Alex already highlighted, right? The way Silvia, contextualize, okay, how the precarity of labor is not only a sign of labor weakness, but also a sign that capital has to, using old Marxist term, they have to depend on living labor, depend on precarity of labor. So in that sense, capital itself is precarious. Okay, and then returning to the national global level, I would say at this point, okay, in light of our earlier discussion about the Indian digital capitalism, is that there's no capitalism that can survive without the nation. Okay, the Japanese philosopher Kojin Karatani calls this the capital nation state, alliance. Okay, we couldn't imagine today the beginning if we use Wallerstein. Okay, at the beginning was Spain and Portugal. They are nation states, not strictly speaking Westphalian, okay, but similar, right? But then later on, every wave, okay, from West Europe to North America to Japan, Southeast Asia, China and India, they always depend on the national. And every time they would claim the British say, oh, we are superior than the French, okay, and the Americans say we are superior than British, and the Japanese said similar. So I think there are the kind of myth, okay, that continues, which is also another, going back to the same point that Alex mentioned, is that it's like without labor, you cannot think about capital. Without nation, you cannot think about capital. Okay, so it's a necessary condition. They borrow, okay, from socialism or Maoist, okay, rhetoric, or a trusteeship, okay, from Nehru and Gandhi this morning, right? So this is a necessary condition, but it's never sufficient. So there's always a struggle there between the national and the local. And the very important, interesting point here, another connection between Lily's book and Silvia's is in the Indian context is the NRI, the non-residential Indian. But in Chinese, it's the diaspora, okay, coming back, okay, to China, yeah. I just want to draw out similar, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know that Angela has her hand up, so just one brief maybe add on to Jack what you were just saying. I think I would also add sort of the role of the state. This is kind of obvious in the case of China, but people always say that it's like, oh, China is different because of the state's involvement. But I think that's so important in terms of, for instance, American context. I think the role of the state when it comes to things like tech investment or finance capitalism is so important to research and study. And yet often there's a tendency to sort of shy away and focus sort of on the tech corporation as the evil culprit and kind of leave the state sort of as the passive, either just a passive endorser of sort of the tech corporation, right? But it's sort of now fashionable to critique Silicon Valley, but the state is still kind of a sort of an innocent bystander almost. And I think, I think an analysis potentially of, and theorizing from India, from China, from not to create a category of the non-West, but theorizing, from outside the West, I think can also really be important and helpful to re-theorize what is happening with regards to financialization and various forms of violence in the Western context, which is sort of an argument to say, often there's sort of like a tendency to turn to ethnographies or qualitative research outside of the American or European context as just being examples of what is happening locally rather than taking them up for their theories, right? And I really want to push against that too, right? To like, when we have like a Western-centric book, it's about theory, and when we have a book that's about, qualitative work elsewhere, it's not theory, right? So I think both Lily and my book hopefully, push also for something like that.
All right, Angela, sorry for letting you wait. Yeah, we have 12 minutes left, so let's make it succinct in both question and answers. All right.
Okay, so Silvia, so happy to listen to your book talk, and also I feel I learned a lot from reading your book. I really have this hard copy here, and I actually drawing a lot of line, which I think is really useful for my work. So I wanted to explain 2 points. The first one is in which way that I extend your socialist approach to my work. So briefly to introduce our work on China's right-hailing giant Didi Chuxing, and also in the first chapter of the manuscript that I'm working, I find I need a term to explain the thing that I wanted to describe, and then the term is a socialist approach. That I borrowed the term from your book. The way in which that I use the term is, I think in your book, you mentioned that this socialist picture functions as a market of financial capitalism, and also actually to use by the government to mobilize people to take, to participate in the innovation. But actually you have mentioned the role of the states and also the importance of the government. I would also suggest that the socialist pitch is also used by the government, not only actually to express the hope for change, the hope for innovation or technological development, but also to express some lingering sense of socialist or some lingering sense of equality that the country actually, I would say that don't have, or at least right now. But the socialist pitch, for example, used by the language of the platform economy or by the language of the sharing economy, actually to express some lingering sense of socialist. So this is my takeaway, the way in which that I extend your socialist pitch to my work. I think it's really the socialist pitch. And also the term socialist pitch can be used as a currency. I would say that the anthropology of money or anthropology of a currency that circulated between the governments and also the corporations, somehow, mobilized by the two to serve their own needs. That government used it to justify its power and to justify its techno-developmentalism regime, but also used by the corporations to serve their own needs, to somehow to have some, to earn some regulatory leniency. So this is the way in which that I learned from you. And then I got the other question, and I think you might explain in your book, but I might miss some detail. The question is, I really hope you can describe two groups. The first one is the entrepreneur who failed. So they wanted to do some entrepreneur, but they failed. And then the other group is how they perceive innovation. And then the other group is the low-skill workers, because I think you might meet a lot of low-skill and service workers in Shenzhen, and how they perceive the innovation and entrepreneurial dream. I ask a question because I read some article written by the Harvard sociologist, Wen, who argued that the most low-skill worker actually really embrace the state vision and also the corporate somehow the language of innovation, and really see them as beneficial for national progress. But actually these workers are the most excluded by the state policy, by the vision of technological development. So I'm really curious about how they perceive the innovation and also entrepreneurship. Thanks, a little bit long.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I really love your thoughts about the socialist pitch as a as something that's a currency circulating between government and corporations. I really look forward to reading your writing on this. I'm super intrigued. So hopefully you and I can talk more about that as well in future. So about your question, so the entrepreneur who failed and the low-skilled workers. So the entrepreneur who failed, I would say failure is something that is often so celebrated in these kinds of contexts, right? And I think this sort of celebration of failure is in many ways a mechanism of exploitation, because it kind of normalizes this process of both austerity and precarity, where people are sort of asked to take a lot of risks, and it's normalized that things won't go well. Most of the startups I met didn't succeed. Like, that's the norm, right? There's a very few so-called unicorns, or like startups that really make it big, but most people can't sustain this kind of entrepreneurial life. It's really, you need to be either independently wealthy to sustain it, right? Or you need to find sort of that, you need to get that sort of investment. So this sort of story of failure that, fail fast and fail quick or whatnot, fail often, is sort of this mantra in the tech industry to actually celebrate and legitimize these very risky and precarious conditions of work. And many people do eventually leave it. So a lot of the startups who were part of the incubator program when I was there did eventually turn to quite quote unquote traditional jobs in the tech industry, where they moved from this very sort of glorious celebratory kind of startup space into more, into kind of employee type relationships and wage labor. And they could, of course, pitch themselves as assets for big tech corporations because of their experience with investment, with manufacturing. So they ended up finding lucrative jobs, right? But by sort of positioning themselves as assets for the corporation. In terms of your question about the low-skilled workers and low-skilled workers who embrace sort of seemingly just, without any ambiguity, sort of the state discourse. I mean, in most of my work, I found people to be actually quite nuanced and not simply just embracing official state discourse. So a lot of the people who I met in the manufacturing industry context, they were quite aware of how they were excluded. And some of them were bitter about that. Other people spoke very explicitly to how they're aware of they don't fit this kind of mass maker space, co-working space, incubator space kind of context, right? So I followed for a while a young man who didn't have a college degree and who was working in what we might construe as or frame as the Shanghai industry, was working as an engineer. And then he started this job at one of the new maker spaces in Shenzhen, which was kind of unpaid. So it wasn't really a job. It was just him being sort of there as a staff worker to help the startups, sort of similar to Sophie and Mei-Yun, who I was talking about today, as happiness workers as well. And he was saying, well, I hope that by attaching myself to these spaces, I might be seen eventually as someone who can have a career in this, right? But he talked about Shenzhen Bay, this other district of Shenzhen, for instance, where Robin eventually went and had his office, as something that was completely out of reach for him. He was saying, I can't go there, I don't fit there, and I know that about myself. And he was someone who, yes, he wanted to be seen as that innovative change maker by the government, but he was also very critical and very ambivalent about his own exclusion from these spaces. So I think that was sort of a theme that I saw throughout, actually. Yeah, but thank you for these great questions. I hope we can talk more about.
Yeah, we only have 3 minutes left, okay, before the informal part. So there's a comment from Wei Yu, which I'm not going to read, but that comment actually contains a question. It's actually trying to ask what Liu Yan would have to say, because Liu Yan is in the room, okay? And by the way, it's not only Liu Yan, we also have David Lee is also in the room. David is sometimes also known as the key person who started the maker movement in China. So first, Liu Yan, please. Yeah, you are our special guest.
Thank you for inviting me. It's such a special occasion to discuss this book. And when I read the book, and I really I have tears really when I read everything Silvia has described, and I particularly like the ethnographic sort of narratives about the happiness labor, and because the first part that Silvia described is very close to my heart and to my practice, and what I have not really heard or read in the book is about this whole happiness labor, which is close to my own practices. I would say the creativity manager or innovation manager, somebody who create a space and community for makers, for engineers and software developers and designers and artists even, to really make them feel a deep sense of bonding and really have a desire and curiosity to talk to each other and collaborate. So yeah, I'm very happy to explore further and how this will apply to this new way of managing creativity, and what does this happiness labor really means. And another very interesting aspect that I learned today is about Robin's story to Africa. I know David has been very much involved in this whole narrative of going overseas and Chuhai and Chuchu and practice, build a different kind of practice in Africa and helping African to build their own economy and become entrepreneurial. And comparing to the Western kind of narrative of, you know, either giving free stuff or, you know, other approach. So maybe David can share more about that, but I'm also interested in, besides archetype like Robin, what are the typical sort of archetypes of Chinese entrepreneurs in Africa as well? So I see that we're running over time, and just to address Wenju's question, yeah, I think you know, when I set up a co-working space like Xindanwei, we didn't really have too much of a agenda of the like what state wants, because that time what we did was very unknown. We didn't even have a term for co-working in China. And we didn't have a term for maker or hacker in China. We invented the terms. And we did that because we saw the needs to mix people from very different disciplines and together, and to think about their practice in a very different way. So just to address Alex's question earlier, is there a different kind of narrative for creativity, and, you know, for people who are like working in the creative industry or tech industry to you know, to show their creativity. There are definitely a lot more rather than just tech focused, you know, very much like building a startup kind of story. And especially from, you know, creative industry sides and art, like arts, and there are many different kind of practice that are active. And because they are not typically seen as the kind of state capitalism and VIP or top tier sort of kind of people, and so they are not really like really kind of well known, but there are quite a lot. And I was actually, to be honest, in the first year when I was in China, first half year when I returned to Shanghai from Netherlands, I was very depressed about, you know, how everybody is so materialistic and money driven, and I couldn't really find anything interesting to be really kind of engaged in until I started to discover something very underground. And there are a lot of people who are working in the scene like theater, visual arts, and, you know, new media. They all have second jobs. But they are actually, beside their job, then they're also practicing all this, you know, creative practice, not only in a local level, but actually global level. Some of the people who have who are advertising agency employee, they're very active dancers in the Contemporary Dance Festival in Amsterdam. So so you come across with this kind of very hidden kind of creativity in China. So that actually inspired me, and actually inspired me to start a space like Xindanwei. Yeah, just to address Wenju's question really briefly. Yeah, I don't know if David's around, and maybe David wants to comment on this as well.
David, please say a few words and for YouTube and the world.
I'm here.
You promised to take me to Africa. I'm still waiting.
I'm here for the party.
Okay, are you sure you don't want to appear? Okay.
It's okay. Yeah, no, I think it's great to have. I mean, Silvia's great work is really looking at providing a different frame to look at China, and I think this is the critical times to be able to look at China in anything other than the mainstream narrative. I was just doing a search. We are celebrating the 20 years of Golden Chang's book about the coming collapse of China. Well, 20 years goes on, 800 million people out of poverty, 24 of GDP growth, and it's still collapsing. So setting the right frame to look at China is important. It's a land of contradictions. It's a land of everything you say about China can be true and false at the same time. So yeah, it's great to have this discussion, and thanks for Silvia to years of labors of putting this into a book.
Can I just say that how especially it feels to have Liu Yan and David here today? That's, yeah, it's, my heart is so full because there's, you know, so few opportunities for us these days with the pandemic to actually have these kinds of conversations, and also 10 years later to reflect. And I'm so intrigued, Liu Yan, by what you were saying about, I know we are out of time, so I'll just say this one thing about how happiness labor shows up in managing creativity and might even show up in your own work right now, actually, right? So yeah, I hope we can talk more about that.
Definitely,
Yeah.
we will talk more. Yeah, after we end the recording. But before we end the recording, I would like to thank Silvia again, and very special thanks to Liu Yan and David. Okay, and let me ask Wei Yu, okay, to say some final words for our week-long, okay, Books Week. Right, maybe just a couple minutes, and then we will end the recording and we will start the party. All right.
Actually, I wasn't really preparing any talks. You know, I just want to say thank you to all our participants. I've noticed many of our own graduate students have been here for almost every talk. You know, thank you so much for showing up. And also our colleagues like Ozan and Alex themselves, right, who generously offered their help during the vacation time. Well, the last person I really want to thank is Jack. Jack, you are like, I was thinking you're like a fairy gentleman or something, you know, because when I first wanted to hold this books talk series, I was really just hoping to meet the authors I admire, right? Then Jack, you know, granted my wish, make it my dream come true, right? So I really thank Jack, and it's such a you know, honor, you know, to have now you meet someone like Liu Yan and David Lee in this virtual meeting. You know, that's totally beyond my dream. It's better than my dream, right? Thank you so much, Jack.
Well, thank you, Wei Yu, because it's all because you initiated the big idea, and I am only your happy labor. Okay, that's all.
Thank you. Free happiness labor.
Yes. Okay, so let's end, okay, the recording. I want to thank very special thanks to was actually moderating when he was still recovering from his high fever, you know, after the second jab. And special thanks to Alex, okay, who provide the wonderful music that I'm going to play now. All right. So Changwen, please end the recording.